Imagine you're a Luftwaffe fighter pilot, not a rookie, an experienced one. You've lived through the Battle of Britain. You've fought Spitfires and Hurricanes. You know British aircraft the way a mechanic knows engines, by silhouette, by sound, by the way they climb and turn. Then, sometime around 1943, you spot something that makes your brain hit the brakes. It's twin engine, sleek. It looks wrong. No big defensive gun turret, no obvious bomber bulk. And the rumor you've heard, yeah, the one everyone laughs at, comes rushing back. It's made of wood. Wood doesn't belong in modern air war, not in 1943, not against radar, flak belts, and some of the best fighters Germany ever built. So you do what you always do. You roll in, shove the throttle forward, and go for the intercept. And this thing, this wooden airplane, doesn't dodge you like it's scared. It simply pulls away. Not barely, not maybe you were at a bad angle. It leaves you, like you're stuck in mud. You get back to base and report it, and you can already hear how it sounds. A wooden plane outran you? A wooden plane with no guns? In daylight? Yeah, right, except it's real. And soon enough, more pilots are coming back with the same story, angry, embarrassed, and honestly kind of shook. Because the de Havilland Mosquito wasn't just fast, it felt unfair, and that's the core reason the Luftwaffe hated it. Not disliked, not respected, hated. If you like WWII deep dives that focus on the why behind the weapons and the people, hit the subscribe button because this story gets crazier the further it goes. Here's what Germany learned the hard way. The Mosquito didn't just break one rule of aerial combat, it broke the whole rule book. It showed up where German controllers didn't expect. It flew profiles that made flak tracking a nightmare. It could run missions without a fighter escort and still come home, again and again, making German defenses look slow and useless. And for a fighter force that was built on the idea of control, that kind of helplessness burns. 1941 to 1942, the harmless wooden oddity. When the first reports came in, German intelligence didn't panic. A British recon aircraft made with lots of wood? Fine. Britain was under pressure. Materials were tight. If the British wanted to glue together an airplane, that sounded like a desperate workaround, not a serious threat. So at first, the Mosquito got mentally filed away as a curiosity. Then the photos started arriving. Not blurry snapshots, not lucky shots. Clear, detailed images of German positions, taken in daylight from altitudes that made interception difficult, and with timing that suggested the British crews weren't just surviving. They were operating with confidence. German fighter units were sent up to catch these intruders, and they kept failing. Over and over, pilots would return furious, making reports that sounded like excuses. The target was too fast, too high, too clean in the air for something that size. Some said it accelerated away when they got close. Others said they never even got close enough to line up properly. Controllers and commanders, at least early on, tended to respond the same way militaries often do. Train harder, fly better, try again. But here's the problem. The Mosquito wasn't giving Germany almost moments. It was giving them nothing. And this is where the emotion flips from annoying to personal. Because German fighter pilots, especially in units that had built reputations since 1939, weren't used to being powerless in the sky. They were used to hunting. Now they were climbing hard, burning fuel, pushing engines, and watching a wooden aircraft slide away across the clouds like it had somewhere better to be. That feeling spreads fast, squadron to squadron, front to front, and you can almost picture the conversations. The first guy tells the story, and everyone jokes. The second guy says the same thing, and the jokes get quieter. The fifth guy says it, and now nobody's laughing because the pattern is real. The Mosquito wasn't a lucky one-off. It was a system. Late 1942, the Mosquito stops watching and starts hitting recon was bad enough. Recon makes you feel exposed, but then the Mosquito's role expands. It isn't just photographing targets anymore. Now it's bombing. And not the way German defenses expected bombers to behave. A classic World War II bomber problem is simple. Bombers are big, they're slower, and they survive by flying in groups and defending themselves, or by being escorted by fighters. The Mosquito didn't play that game. It could hit targets in daylight with little or no escort because its real defense was speed and profile. It didn't have to stand and fight. It didn't have to drag a ball turret around like an anchor. It could get in, drop, and leave. From the German side, that creates a brutal situation. How do you explain to your leadership that the British are bombing important places with an aircraft you can't reliably intercept? How do you admit that your fighter force, your pride, is being embarrassed by a plane that isn't even armed like a normal bomber? If you're a commander, you do what commanders do. You try counters, more fighters, better pilots, new intercept routes, tweaked tactics, different altitudes, and the Mosquito keeps getting through. The most painful part isn't even the explosions. It's the message. We can do this whenever we want. And every time a Mosquito crew returns safely, that message gets louder. Why it was so hard to stop. To understand the hate, you have to understand the trap. German air defense was built to deal with threats in categories. High-altitude bombers, you track them. Mass fighters, EWAND, time interceptions. Night bombers, you use radar, searchlights, and specialized night fighters. Low-level attackers, you use local flak belts and alert fighters nearby. The Mosquito could blur those categories. It could fly high or low depending on the job. It could move fast enough that your timing had to be perfect. It could appear, strike, and vanish before defenses even got coordinated. Even when German radar or spotters detected one, the time window was small. Controllers had to vector fighters quickly and correctly. Pilots had to already be in the right place or have the altitude advantage. If not, the Mosquito was gone. And that creates a special kind of anger. Not fear, not respect. Anger, because it feels like the British are cheating, even though they aren't. They're just exploiting a design that makes the normal rules stop working. The psychological punch. We're doing this in daylight. There's another layer here that people forget. Pride. The Luftwaffe had dominated the early years of the war. Poland, France, big chunks of Europe. The whole image was control of the air. So when a British aircraft starts treating German airspace like a shortcut, flying in broad daylight and escaping, what it threatens is more than targets. It threatens the belief system. Fighter pilots can accept danger. They can accept losses. That's war. What's harder to accept is being made irrelevant. And that's the vibe the Mosquito brought with it. It wasn't begging to survive. It wasn't trying to tank damage with armor. It wasn't trying to win a turning fight. It was basically saying, you don't matter. We're not here for you. For a fighter pilot, someone trained to believe the sky belongs to them, that's humiliating. By 1943, you start hearing the informal rules forming. Don't waste fuel chasing one unless you're perfectly positioned. Don't risk your aircraft trying to force a miracle intercept. And honestly, don't even get your hopes up. That's not respect. That's resignation beginning to creep in. The Mosquito becomes a precision problem. Here's where things get worse for Germany. The Mosquito isn't just a fast bomber. It becomes a precision weapon. Instead of giant streams of aircraft, you might get one Mosquito or a pair showing up for a specific job. Not random area bombing. Targeted hits. That matters because precision attacks are like a scalpel in a war that often used hammers. They're meant to break specific parts of a system, a headquarters, a key factory section, a communications point, a rail yard choke, and the Mosquito could deliver those hits with timing and surprise that made defense feel pointless. German flak crews hated it for a different reason than fighter pilots did. A pilot can at least try to chase. A flak crew has to spot, track, aim, lead, and fire, while the target screams past the engagement zone like it's late for an appointment. Against something that fast, by the time the guns swing around, it's already moving out of the best firing window. That's why accounts from German defenders often describe the same sensation. You hear engines, you catch a glimpse, you try to react, and then it's gone. And then you feel stupid for even trying. Okay, so what do we do? That question starts showing up everywhere in German air defense thinking because you can't build a perfect wall against something that can choose height, choose route, and choose timing, while also moving too fast for your normal playbook. You can try to predict it, but it doesn't have to follow the predictable paths of big bomber streams. You can try to swarm it, but swarming requires you to already know where it's going. You can try to catch it with altitude advantage, but altitude advantage requires early warning and perfect coordination. And when any one of those pieces is missing, the result is the same. The Mosquito does its job and heads back across the water. And every successful mission adds one more invisible bruise to German morale, because it makes the defenders feel watched, outplayed, and late to everything. Now here's the turning point for the story. Once the Mosquito proves it can't just survive over German-controlled territory, but can strike precise, high-value targets and vanish, German hatred shifts from "this is annoying" to "this is unbearable," because at that point, it's not just an aircraft. It's a threat to the idea that the Luftwaffe can protect anything at all. And in Part 2, you'll see how the Mosquito turns that frustration into something close to obsession, especially once it starts attacking in ways designed to wreck Germany's nerves, night after night. By mid-1943, the Mosquito had done something no enemy aircraft was supposed to do so consistently. It made German air defenses feel obsolete, not challenged, not under pressure, obsolete. Fighter pilots hated it because they couldn't catch it unless everything lined up perfectly. Flak crews hated it because it was often gone before they could even settle their sights. And the people running radar rooms and control centers hated it because it forced them into the worst job in warfare, reacting to a threat you can't predict. But the moment the hate really hardened, when it turned into something deeper, was when the Mosquito started attacking Germany's sleep. Not just factories, not just rail yards. Sleep. 1943 to 1944. The night war becomes personal. German cities were already used to air raids by this point. Big raids had a terrible pattern: sirens, bombers, explosions, fires, then the long cleanup. Brutal, but at least it was understandable. Bomber streams were big. They took time to form up. They were detectable. German defenses could at least attempt a structured response. The Mosquito didn't give them that. RAF planners discovered something that was both clever and cruel. You don't need 1,000 heavy bombers to wreck a city's nerves. A small number of Mosquitoes could do it, because they were fast enough to get in and out before the normal interception machinery could bite. And they were consistent enough to keep returning, night after night, until the idea of rest became a joke. Picture it from the ground. You hear the air raid siren, you stumble into a shelter, you wait, nothing happens. Then you go back upstairs, try to sleep, and an hour later, the sirens go again. And again. A single bomb drops, then silence, then more waiting, then another bomb, at a different time, from a different direction. There's no rhythm you can settle into. No, okay, the wave passed. Just uncertainty. That's the point. German officials often labeled these as nuisance raids, small raids meant to irritate. But nuisance doesn't begin to cover what they did to a city's mental state. Workers already worn down by long shifts didn't recover. Families didn't sleep. People lived in a constant loop of tension. Stand down, stand up, run to shelter, come back out, repeat. And the Luftwaffe, especially its night defense network, couldn't stop the pattern. Why night fighters struggled so badly? German night fighters were dangerous aircraft in the right situation. They were built to hunt large bombers flying predictable routes at predictable speeds. A Lancaster or Halifax is big. It leaves a strong radar signature. It's part of a stream. It's not sprinting. Mosquitoes weren't that kind of target. They were smaller and faster. They could change their profile, and their speed shrank the window for interception to almost nothing. Even if radar picked up the general idea, something moving through the night sky, getting a fighter into the exact spot at the exact moment was a nightmare. A lot of night interception is timing, where you think the target will be when you arrive. If your target is slow, you have room for error. If your target is a Mosquito, your room for error is basically gone. A night fighter could be vectored toward it, push engines hard, and still never see it. Sometimes a crew would only hear the distant growl of engines in the dark, then nothing. And nothing makes a hunter angrier than hearing prey and never laying eyes on it. Over time, the frustration changes texture. At first, it's, we just need better vectors. Then it becomes, we're doing everything right and still getting nothing. Then it becomes silence, because even complaining starts to feel pointless. Berlin, the propaganda wound. Now add Berlin. Berlin wasn't just another city. It was the symbol, the capital, the place that was supposed to be defended no matter what. It had layers of flak, searchlights, fighter bases, radar coverage. It was one of the most protected pieces of airspace in Europe. And still, Mosquitoes were getting through. Not always in huge numbers, sometimes solo. sometimes pairs. But that was part of the humiliation. If Berlin could be touched by a handful of fast wooden aircraft, what did that say about the Luftwaffe's promise to protect the Reich? This wasn't just tactical damage. It was a propaganda injury, a public confidence leak, and it put pressure at the top. When leadership demands results, the system reacts like a machine under stress. More orders, more urgency, more fix it now. So the Luftwaffe tried. They adjusted patrol zones. They pushed fighters higher to try to gain altitude advantage. They experimented with different equipment and tactics intended to catch fast intruders in the dark. Some night fighters carried upward-firing weapons designed to attack bombers from below. Some units tried to set traps near likely approaches, hoping the Mosquitoes would pass through a predictable corridor. But the Mosquito wasn't forced to play predictable. It could come from odd angles. It could shift altitude. It could vary timing. It could choose when to engage the target and when to disappear. And when your enemy can choose the rules, you're stuck reacting. The written record starts to change. There's a small but telling sign of defeat that shows up in any war. Paperwork gets shorter. When a force believes it can solve a problem, reports are detailed. They list causes, fixes, new tactics, new hopes. When a force starts to accept it can't solve a problem, the writing turns flat. Enemy activity observed. No contact. No interception. That's it. Not because they didn't care, because they cared too much. Writing more just meant documenting failure in greater detail. The Mosquito did that to German air defense forces. It turned their nightly efforts into a loop of detection, scramble, disappointment, and exhaustion. The civilian side, the Mosquito plague. For civilians, the Mosquito became a different kind of enemy. You can't shoot it down yourself. You can't predict it. You can't bargain with it. And you can't even understand it because it doesn't behave like the aircraft you've been told to expect. To a person on the ground, a Mosquito raid might feel like this. You hear engines, you tense up, you wait for impact. And then, either the bomb lands nearby or it doesn't. There's no closure. And the next night, it happens again. People started to talk about it like a recurring sickness. It comes back. It fades. It returns. It spreads anxiety. That's what makes these raids so poisonous. They weren't always the biggest blasts. They were constant reminders that the shield wasn't working. And the Luftwaffe felt that same shame from the inside. Because their whole purpose, especially on the home front, was to be the shield. Goering's problem, you can't admit what's happening. A big piece of the Mosquito story is how hard it is to admit weakness when your whole identity is strength. If you're the leadership, you can't easily say, we have an aircraft problem we can't fix. So instead, you demand more effort, more urgency, more innovation, build something faster, deploy more night fighters, change tactics again. But the Mosquito's advantage wasn't one single trick. It was the total package: speed, altitude flexibility, mission variety, and the simple fact that it didn't need to fight you to defeat you. It just had to complete the mission and leave. German attempts to solve the Mosquito Germany's engineers and commanders were not lazy. They understood the challenge. The issue was time and reality. To catch a Mosquito reliably, you need an aircraft that can do more than match its speed. You need to get into a favorable position before it arrives and keep the advantage during the engagement. That requires a chain of perfect conditions: early detection, accurate tracking, correct vectoring, a fighter already positioned with the right altitude and speed, and a pilot who can make a split-second attack before the target slips away, miss one piece, and the Mosquito escapes. So Germany tried to tighten the chain. They pushed for faster interceptors and improved night fighting setups. They tried to refine procedures and equipment meant to intercept high-speed intruders. But the Mosquito's biggest advantage wasn't that it was impossible to hit. It was that it made Germany spend money, fuel, and manpower chasing shadows, while Britain spent less effort sending 2 men in a wooden aircraft to cause the problem in the first place. And that imbalance is exactly what breeds hate. The emotional truth: it felt like mockery. There's another reason the Mosquito hit a nerve. It wasn't hiding. A lot of air war feels like brute force: big formations, long battles, heavy losses. The Mosquito felt like confidence bordering on disrespect. Daylight missions early on, solo flights, clean getaways, repeated success. To German pilots and gunners, it didn't feel like the British were merely surviving. It felt like the British were saying, "Try it, stop us." And not being able to stop something you can see, or at least detect, is a special kind of humiliation. It's not just we lost. It's we didn't even get a chance to compete. By 1944, the Mosquito had reached a strange status in German thinking. It wasn't an occasional threat anymore. It was a constant, a problem that showed up on schedules, in rumors, in tired eyes and shorter reports, in angry conversations that ended the same way. What are we supposed to do? And the most honest answer was, not much. But here's the part where the story takes its sharpest turn, because as bad as it was to be outsmarted and outrun, the final insult wasn't the Mosquito bombing Germany. The final insult was what it started doing to the Luftwaffe itself. By 1944, the Mosquito wasn't just a headache for Germany. It was a statement. Every time one slipped through, it wasn't only proving British skill. It was proving German limits, and doing it in the most embarrassing way possible, with speed, precision, and a plane that didn't even look like it should belong in a modern war. But the Luftwaffe still had one comfort, at least in their own minds. Fine, maybe we can't catch it consistently, but it's still their raider, their bomber, their problem. Then came the final insult. The Mosquito didn't just keep operating, it started hunting the hunters. 1944 to 1945. When the Mosquito turns on the Luftwaffe. Late in the war, as Germany's air defense system was already strained, fuel shortages, tired crews, shrinking time to train replacements, the Mosquito expanded into even more roles. It hit rail lines and junctions. It targeted communications. It attacked infrastructure that kept German forces moving. It supported strikes on highly defended points and helped guide larger raids by marking targets. It also went after things Germany desperately needed to protect in the war's final phase, launch and supply areas tied to new weapons, plus critical transport links. The important point isn't that it did any single mission better than everything else. It's that it could do a lot of missions well, and it could do them with a speed profile that broke Germany's response cycle. Germany couldn't build a single defense plan that covered all Mosquito possibilities because the Mosquito wasn't one kind of aircraft doing one kind of job. It was a toolbox. And then it became a predator. The night intruder problem. Here's what a night defense system depends on. Routine. Night fighters take off, climb, patrol, intercept, then return to land. Ground crews refuel, rearm, reset. The airfield is the heartbeat. Now imagine an enemy aircraft shows up specifically to mess with that heartbeat. Mosquitoes began operating as night intruders, patrolling near German airfields and hunting the Luftwaffe's night fighters at their most vulnerable moments. And that's the part that made German crews furious, because it felt like the Mosquito was breaking a second rule. It wasn't just escaping interception. It was turning Germany's own defensive rhythm into a trap. Night fighters coming back after hours in the dark were often low on fuel. Pilots were tired. They were focused on landing. They were at lower speed, configured for approach, and they couldn't just punch the throttle and climb away instantly. That landing pattern, the predictable part of the whole system, was exactly what an intruder can exploit. A Mosquito could appear at the edge of the airfield area, strike quickly, and vanish before a proper response could form. Sometimes the goal was to damage aircraft on the ground. Sometimes it was to disrupt operations, hit a runway, force chaos, keep the base on edge, make everyone jumpy, and reduce the number of effective sorties the Luftwaffe could generate. And here's why that felt so personal. The Luftwaffe's night fighters were supposed to be the specialists, the elite defensive hunters. Now they were the prey. That mental flip, being hunted by the thing you can't catch, was brutal. Okay, build something that can catch it. Germany did try. When you read late-war German aircraft development, you can see the logic. Make interceptors that are faster, climb better, and operate higher. Planes like the TA-152 and the DO-335 are often brought up in this context because they represent Germany pushing for high performance, especially in speed and altitude capability. But even when an aircraft has the raw performance to threaten a Mosquito, you still have the same real-world problem. You don't fight the spec sheet. You fight timing. The Mosquito didn't hang around. It didn't circle and dogfight unless it absolutely had to. It did the job and left. So Germany's catch-it solution required the perfect chain of events. Detect the Mosquito early enough, track it accurately enough, put the interceptor in the right place with the right altitude advantage, and execute the attack within seconds. Late in the war, that chain got weaker. not stronger. Fuel became scarce, training hours dropped, radar and command networks were stressed by the overall air situation, veteran pilots were being lost faster than they could be replaced. So even if the technology gap narrowed in certain moments, the operational reality made consistent interception harder, and the Mosquito kept doing what it had always done: show up, strike, disappear. The wider effect: it made defenses waste effort. One of the sneakiest strengths of the Mosquito wasn't just what it destroyed, it was what it forced Germany to spend. Every time controllers scrambled fighters for a Mosquito that couldn't be caught, that was fuel burned, engines worn, pilots exhausted, and attention pulled away from other threats. Every time flak units fired at a fast-moving target that was already leaving the engagement zone, that was ammunition spent and morale drained. And because Mosquito raids could be small and irregular, sometimes one aircraft, sometimes a few, Germany could never relax. It kept the whole system twitchy. That kind of pressure doesn't show up as one huge explosion. It shows up as a slow breakdown, reduced readiness, tired decision-making, mistakes, and the feeling that the enemy controls your schedule. The reckoning. Why the hate was so intense. So why did the Luftwaffe hate the Mosquito so much? Not because it was the deadliest aircraft of the war in raw numbers. Not because it won huge dogfights. They hated it because it proved them wrong about the fundamentals. Germany believed speed required heavy engines and strong metal construction. The Mosquito was largely wooden and still extremely fast for its class. Germany believed bombers needed heavy defensive armament to survive. The Mosquito often relied on not being catchable in the first place, and it suffered remarkably low losses compared to many other bomber types. Germany believed modern air power worked best when aircraft were specialized into narrow roles. The Mosquito showed the opposite. One basic airframe could be adapted into reconnaissance, precision strike, pathfinding support, intruder operations, and more. And, maybe the sharpest point of all, Germany believed its fighter force was the answer to any intruder. The Mosquito made many fighter pilots feel like spectators. That's not just tactical frustration, that's humiliation. Because fighter culture is built around agency, choosing the engagement, controlling the fight, being the one who decides. The Mosquito took that away. It made the Luftwaffe react, and reacting is exhausting. The production reality, it was everywhere. Now add one more layer that made it sting. Britain didn't build a handful of Mosquitoes. It built thousands over the course of the war, enough that the Mosquito wasn't an occasional threat. It was a steady presence, and Germany didn't shoot down anything close to most of them. A lot of Mosquito crews completed their missions and came home. So from the German point of view, it wasn't like fighting a rare superplane that shows up once in a while. It was fighting something that kept returning, like an opponent who never gets tired. That's why the emotional tone shifted over time. Early war. What is this weird wooden aircraft? Middle war. Why can't we stop it? Late war. It's still here. And now it's hunting us. The final message over Germany. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing under pressure from all directions. The Luftwaffe wasn't the same force it had been in 1940 or 1941, and in that final phase, the Mosquito was still doing what it did best, moving fast, striking precisely, and making defenses feel pointless. It kept attacking the links that mattered: transport, communications, and the ability to coordinate a response. It kept showing up with the same ugly implication: we can reach you. And that's the psychological victory that made the Mosquito feel like a nightmare. It wasn't only about damage, it was about certainty. The defenders couldn't be sure where it would appear, when it would appear, or whether they could do anything about it if it did. And if you're a Luftwaffe pilot who grew up in a culture that worshipped air superiority, that kind of helplessness doesn't just irritate you, it makes you furious. The truth at the end. Here's the cleanest way to say it. The Luftwaffe didn't hate the Mosquito because it constantly slaughtered German fighters in dramatic air battles. Most pilots never got a clean shot at one. They hated it because it exposed a gap they couldn't close. Every successful Mosquito mission was proof that Germany's defenses, fighters, flak, radar control, had limits that British design and planning were exploiting with almost casual confidence. The Mosquito didn't need to beat the Luftwaffe in a classic showdown. It simply needed to make the Luftwaffe fail at its job, stopping raids. And in war, Nothing humiliates a defensive force more than watching the enemy do the job right in front of you and being unable to stop it. That's why the Mosquito became more than a plane in German minds. It became a symbol, a wooden aircraft that shouldn't have worked, but did. A fast aircraft that didn't need to fight because it could ignore you, and an aircraft that over time didn't just win missions, it won the psychological war by making an entire air defense system feel one step behind every single night.